Hi there, it's Josh, and I'm here at All Flutes Plus, and today in our Demystifying the Flute series, we are going to talk about how a 2-foot-long tube fits in a tiny case like this, and I'm going to tell you all about the different parts of the flute. So the first part of the flute that we're going to talk about is the part that makes the sound, and we call this the head joint. The head joint is the part of the flute that you blow into, and you can actually create a sound on the head joint by itself. And in fact, if you have a young child who's just learning the flute, their teacher will probably have them do this. And the head joint fits into what we call the body. The body of the flute is the biggest piece of the flute, and it is where almost all of the keys are on the flute. So it is the heaviest, longest, and most complicated part of the flute. And then at the end of the flute, the body tube slides into what we call the foot joint, which contains the lowest notes on the flute, and also the E-flat key, which you will hold open for nearly every note you play on the flute, which also helps you balance the flute in your hands. And this is how a 2-foot-long tube fits into a tiny little case. So now that we've discovered that the flute itself comes apart into 3 pieces, each of these pieces is actually also made up of multiple smaller pieces. So the first thing we're going to talk about is all of the pieces that make up the head joint of the flute. So obviously, of course, it's one long tube. So we call it the head joint tube. And if you look at the head joint tube from the end, you'll see that this curvy thing here, which is called the lip plate, which is what rests against your face, doesn't actually touch the tube at all. You see it sort of floats. It is connected to the head joint tube by a shorter tube, a vertical tube that goes this way, which is called the riser. And sometimes when you're shopping for flutes, even at the student level, such as the Trevor James 10X, you will see that a flute will say that it has a 925 silver lip and riser, or a silver lip with a 14 karat gold riser. And so what that means, if you see a 14 karat gold riser, is that this smaller tube that connects the lip plate to the head joint main tube will be made of solid 14 karat gold, or silver. Sometimes they're platinum or 18 karat gold. There's a million things they can be made of. At the top of the flute, we have the crown, rather fittingly, I would say. And the crown actually unscrews, because the crown's primary function is to adjust a piece of the head joint that you can't see, which lives inside, called the cork, and it literally looks like a wine bottle cork. And what this does is regulates the tuning of the entire flute. And the cork sits on a threaded stopper, and at the end is a little metal flat plate, which is usually called the cork stopper. So there are actually 6 different pieces that make up the head joint: the tube, the lip, the riser, the crown, the cork, and the stopper. And all of these are assembled into this tiny little noisemaker. And that's the flute head joint. The next part of the flute we're going to talk about is the body, which is the part of the flute that you actually hold on to, where 90% of the key work is. And the body, much like the head joint, consists of one long tube that has a bunch of other stuff stuck onto it. And in the case of the body, that's the keys. But there is also something called the barrel, which is where the piece that the head joint actually slides into, so it's sort of a telescoping mechanism. The barrel is a separate piece from the body that is soldered on, and there are rings that are soldered on to the barrel, which are primarily decorative in function. There have been flutes made without them. And then along the tube, which is of course full of holes that have been drilled into it, there are these long, flat plates called ribs that are soldered to the tube. And these ribs hold posts, these sort of little knobby things that you see at the end of the keys, which are soldered onto the ribs, which are soldered onto the body. And these posts hold what are called rods, which is quite self-explanatory, I think, these long things. And the rods hold the keys of the flute, the little things that cover the holes and move up and down. And if you look underneath the keys on the body of the flute, what you will see, they're usually yellow. You will see these sort of yellow soft discs, which we call pads. And these are what actually enables the keys to seal the holes in the body of the flute to produce the different pitches of the flute. The keys move up and down by the action of something we call springs. And if you look inside the rods of the flute, you'll see these tiny, tiny little, they almost look like sewing needles, and they are in fact called needle springs. Collectively, these rods and keys and posts are together called the mechanism of the flute. And on student level and intermediate level flutes, and even some handmade flutes, this mechanism is usually made of a lightweight nickel alloy that is then heavily plated in silver. And at the end of the body, you'll see there's a sort of a slightly narrower section of metal, which we call the tenon. And this is the part that the foot joint slides onto, and we'll talk about the foot joint next. And lastly, we have the very end of the flute, which is called the foot joint. It's a cute little, this happens to be a C foot joint, as we've made another video about. And the foot joint fits over that little thin tenon on the end of the body joint, and it has the same assembly of ribs and posts and rods and keys, but of course far fewer of them. This only has 2 keys on it, plus, well, 3 actually, because there's the E flat key on the front. Like the body, the foot joint also has rings that are added to it, usually for decorative effect, but the foot joint has its own version of the barrel, and you'll see on most student flutes, there's a ring here on this end, but there is not a ring here, but you'll notice there's a ridge. And if you look inside, you can see that this is actually a sleeve that has been soldered over the end. And that is the part that fits over the tenon. And that, funnily, is called the foot joint box, even though it's round. Now, on more expensive flutes, you will see that there is also a ring here on this end of the foot joint box, but that's usually not something you see on less expensive flutes. And that completes the flute. The 3 parts together, the head joint, the body, and the foot joint, make a flute. They're actually really quite fascinating and complicated little machines. Every flute, it has over 300 parts. If you count all of the springs and the pads, and there are little things that hold the pads in, which are called grommets, it's really fascinating. And there is an art to making a flute in and of itself. So they're really, really beautiful, beautiful things that should be appreciated and cared for as the beautiful works of art that they are.